That's a powerful and emotional story concept. I'll craft an engaging, suspenseful, and human-centric introduction that captivates your audience while keeping it within YouTube's guidelines. Here's the introduction to your story, Stopped. Generating. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening for Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. At 72 years old, she had lived long enough to know the world could be cruel, but she never imagined she would find herself on the cold pavement, knees aching, hands trembling, as flashing red and blue lights painted the street around her. The officers standing over her, 3 of them, looked at her with cold, detached expressions, barking orders as if she were some kind of criminal. "Get down! Hands where we can see them!" one of them shouted, his voice sharp and impatient. "I didn't do anything," Eleanor pleaded, her voice steady but tired. "I'm just trying to get home." She had been walking back from the corner store, a small bag of groceries clutched in her hands. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and some tea. Simple things. But somehow that walk had turned into this. The officers had approached her without warning, demanding identification, accusing her of something she didn't understand. One of them claimed she matched a description. That phrase, so vague yet so heavy, hung in the air. She had heard it too many times in her life. Her body protested as she was forced to kneel. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and the hard concrete beneath them felt like punishment for a crime she hadn't committed. People in the neighborhood had begun to gather, watching in silent outrage. Some whispered, some recorded on their phones, but no one dared to step forward. They knew better. And then, one of the officers reached for his radio. "We've got a situation here," he muttered, preparing to escalate things further. Eleanor closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She had spent her life teaching her son to remain calm in situations like these. Never give them a reason, she had always told him. And now, she had to take her own advice. But then, something changed. A voice crackled through the officer's radio. And as soon as he heard the name being spoken on the other end, his entire demeanor shifted. The confidence in his stance wavered, and he exchanged a nervous glance with his partners. The officer, who had been the most aggressive, suddenly stepped back, his face losing color. "Wait," he said, shaking his head. This can't be right." Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes to look at them, their arrogance crumbling. Something about her identity had sent a shockwave through them, and at that moment, she knew they had just realized who her son was. One of the officers, the one who had grabbed his radio, took a shaky step back. His hands trembled slightly as he glanced at his partner, searching for some kind of reassurance, but there was none. The realization had hit them all at the same time, and now they stood frozen, uncertainty creeping into their once authoritative stance. Eleanor didn't move. Her knees ached. Her dignity had been bruised. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply watched, waiting. She had learned patience over the years. She had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. "Are we sure?" One of the younger officers muttered under his breath, his voice just low enough that only his colleagues could hear. The officer with the radio nodded slowly. His face was pale, his confidence from moments before completely gone. "Yeah, it's her." Eleanor could see the change in their eyes. The power they had wielded so easily just moments ago was slipping through their fingers. And now they were afraid, not of her, but of what they had just done. The neighborhood was still watching. Some people had pulled out their phones, recording every second of this unfolding moment. It was no longer just an old woman on the ground. It was something bigger. It was proof. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to her son. She had raised him in this very neighborhood, taught him everything she knew about respect, perseverance, and survival. He had grown up watching the world treat her unfairly, had seen the way she was followed in stores, ignored in restaurants, dismissed when she spoke. He had made a promise, one that had shaped his entire life. Now that promise was the very thing that had these officers shaking in their boots. One of them, the tallest, the one who had forced her to kneel, finally spoke. His voice was unsteady. "Ma'am, we didn't realize." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She had nothing to say. What could she say? That it was okay, that she understood. She had lived long enough to know that an apology wouldn't change what had just happened. It wouldn't erase the humiliation, the pain in her joints, the way her heart had raced in fear. A sudden commotion down the street made the officers turn their heads. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and then, just as quickly, the sea of people began to part. Someone was coming. The officers tensed. Their faces paled even further. And Eleanor, she just closed her eyes for a brief moment, a quiet relief settling in her bones. She knew exactly who was about to arrive. The roar of an engine came to a stop, and then a door slammed shut. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed against the pavement. A voice, deep, commanding, and unmistakable, cut through the thick tension in the air. "What the hell is going on here?" The officers straightened, their bodies rigid, their gazes locked. Onto the man, now standing just a few feet away. Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes. And there he was, her son, a man who had fought his entire life to make a difference, a man who had worked twice as hard, pushed twice as far, just to ensure that no one else would have to endure the things he had witnessed growing up. A man these officers never expected to face tonight. The crowd was silent now, waiting. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do, because the man standing before them wasn't just anyone. He was someone they all knew, someone they never wanted to cross. And now they had no choice but to face him. The silence was thick enough to feel. The officers, who had moments ago commanded authority, now looked uncertain, their backs stiff, their hands twitching near their belts. They weren't just dealing with any angry family member. They were dealing with him. Eleanor's son stepped forward, his gaze hard and unwavering. He was tall, powerful in his presence, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of standing firm in the face of injustice. He wasn't just a man who had overcome the odds. He was a man who had changed them. One of the officers swallowed hard. "Sir, But her son raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't," he said, his voice steady. "I want to hear from my mother first." He turned to Eleanor, his sharp expression softening for the first time since he arrived. His eyes searched hers, reading the pain, the exhaustion, the quiet dignity she had always carried. "Mom," he said gently, "are you okay?" Eleanor took a slow breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into her chest. She nodded, but that wasn't enough for him. He knew her too well. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said, his voice lowering just enough for only her to hear. "Not for them. Not for anyone." She felt something shift inside her, a heaviness she had carried for too long. A part of her wanted to let it go, to break down, to say everything she had swallowed for years, but she had lived long enough to know that pain didn't always need words. Sometimes the silence spoke louder. She reached out, her fingers grazing his hand. A simple touch, but one filled with everything she wanted to say. Her son turned back to the officers, his expression hardening once more. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The officers exchanged nervous glances, but none of them spoke. You didn't stop an armed suspect. You didn't prevent a crime. You didn't protect this neighborhood, he continued, his voice calm but firm. All you did was humiliate an elderly woman because you thought you could. One of the officers, the one who had been the most aggressive, cleared his throat. Sir, Don't call me sir now, her son cut in, his voice sharper. You didn't show that respect when you forced my mother to her knees. The crowd murmured in agreement. People who had been silent before now stood taller, their presence no longer just that of bystanders. The energy in the air had shifted. The officers weren't in control anymore. And then, Eleanor's son did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and held it up for everyone to see. The officers' faces drained of color. The crowd gasped. You had no idea, did you? He said, shaking his head. You arrested the mother of the police chief. One of the officers actually took a step back, as if distance could somehow erase what had just happened. The weight of their mistake crashed down on them all at once. Eleanor had spent her whole life watching men like these throw their power around, never thinking they'd have to answer for it. But tonight was different. Tonight, they had picked the wrong woman. Her son turned to the crowd, his voice carrying across the street. How many times has this happened when no one was watching? How many times has someone's mother, father, sister, or brother been treated like this, with no cameras, no witnesses, no justice? The silence that followed was deafening. The officers stood frozen, their arrogance gone, replaced with something dangerously close to fear. They knew what was coming next. They knew this moment would follow them. Eleanor watched them closely, but she felt no satisfaction, no victory. She had lived too long, seen too much, to believe that one moment could undo decades of injustice. But maybe, just maybe, this moment could start something. Her son let out a slow breath, then looked back at her. Let's go home, Mom. And with that, he took her arm, steadying her as she rose to her feet. The officers didn't stop them. They couldn't. As they walked away, Eleanor didn't look back. She didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one carrying the weight of the world. Tonight, the burden belonged to those who had created it, and for once, they had to face it alone.